stuff on YouTube and things like that. Welcome everyone to the patch 7.7 rundown. Phreak here, covering everything coming into this patch. I did read it before. I have a generally good understanding of what's going on. Worth pointing out that 7.7 for most professional regions is a non-patch. Most regions are playing 7.6 for playoffs, and I believe that mid-season invitational is going to be on 7.8. So 7.7 will really never see pro play. But what's nice is it'll let the designers see the impact of 7.7 in solo queue and see if they went too far on things for 7.8, which again, I believe is the MSI patch. But generally speaking, this as well as 7.8 will be pretty small for competitive regions, but will otherwise be pretty solo queue focused. So a lot of the champions you hit are weak or good in solo queue, but won't really see pro play. So let's get into it. 7.7. First off is Amumu. Now, it's actually interesting. This is actually out of alphabetical order because L comes before M. So it's actually going to mess with my screenshots. But Amumu is getting several changes. So his passive is changing from a magic resist shred that is 15, 20, or 25. And instead, it is a 15% magic damage amp. Now, I want to tell a quick story. This was about to be not as 50% damage amp. Basically, this 15% right now, when it's going to come out, is going to be after mitigation. So if I hit you for 100 damage and you have 100 magic resist, you'll take 50 damage, and then that will be amped by 15% and become true damage. It was almost 50% before MR, meaning you would take 15 damage out of this instead of half of 15. I think I misspoke at some point, but essentially this is after resists, so it's just 15% more damage, but the number shows up as white. It shows up as true damage. And of course, it affects your teammates as well as yourself, which means it's functionally identical to an MR shred outside of where the diminishing returns kick in, but that's kind of the same here. Despair, actually this is my fault, I'm pretty sure. I was pretty certain that at least at 10%, the change here was going to be a nerf to a lot of his early game and his jungle pathing, and so the damage got bumped by 2. It's also nice because it will now refresh the Cursed Touch passive, so that's just a benefit, obviously, in its own right. The half tech and tick actually is, I don't know if it's better per se. It'll make it feel better, but it can technically be a DPS loss since Despair ticks the second you turn it on. Really, it's not really a big deal. And then his ultimate will actually apply this shred to everybody, or this damage amp, I should say, to everybody after dealing the damage, which is also, of course, quite a big buff. Now, of course, it wouldn't be one of my things without some numbers, so let's start with Amumu. And this is actually the numbers on whether the shred was better or worse than the damage amp. And I've got several different charts here. So first of all, if you're hitting squishies at, basically, this is, by the way, every champion spawns at 30 MR if you didn't know. And if people are running magic resist glyphs, they're going to be at 42, which is about this number. These are the general numbers here that you're going to be seeing for most of your target hits. And it's worth noting that pre-6, basically everything is better. It's also worth noting, by the way, that you're seeing diminishing returns as they go towards negative. This means that against your early game jungle camps, it's actually a buff as well. So Amumu basically is always better pre-6 with the shred. Once you get into mid to late game, you can see that the break point is around 52-ish magic resist and around like 95 magic resist. So you are worse at killing and helping your team kill squishies in the late game, but you are always better pre-6, and you are a better tank killer, both for yourself and your team, because that shred, remember, helps your entire team's magic damage output. So that's where the breakpoints are. I would say this is generally a buff. The exception being maybe AP Amumu, who wanted a one-shot squishies, is going to have a harder time doing that, but the differences are pretty small, right? Against this is 42 MR, right? It's like 16% instead of 50% damage amp. These are pretty close. And again, this is obviously how much shred you were getting versus the 15% damage amp. Obviously, you can see the breakpoints. This, by the way, is a quick look at how much the Despair buffs helped his jungle clear. We already know from our old chart that pre-6 is better, but I wanted to show you how much better it is. This is the health values of the Big Raptor at its lowest and highest health value, the Big Krug at its lowest and highest health value, the Big Wolf at highest and lowest health value, and the Big Gromp at lowest and highest health values. After level 8, they stop gaining HPs. This is the sum total of possible health pools. What's also nice is the scaling of the percent health damage to the base damage is entirely linear. So whether it's rank 1, 2, 3, 4, or 5 doesn't change these numbers, and so you're seeing a 13 to 5% damage amp based on what you're hitting. So the Despair buffs are roughly a 10% damage amp. It's less against small monsters, but those died to Tantrum anyway. Obviously, the clear speed gain is, again, to the tune of 5 to 13%. The damage amp is the tune of something pretty decent. And just to make doubly sure, because negative magic resist is really freaking weird, I again looked at the total possible MR values for Krugs, Gromp, Raptors, and Wolves, and looked at how much you were getting out of the Shred versus how much you were going to get out of the 50% damage amp. It's worth noting that late game, Wolves and Raptors are a bit slower. You can see that like the mid-game Raptors are kind of identical. But basically, because Despair is doing more damage, and realistically it's not that huge of a deal, technically you're a bit worse at killing Wolves, and technically you're a bit worse at killing Raptors in the late game. There you go. There's some numbers for you. I plugged those in. You're welcome. It's amazing. Ultimately, these are gigantic buffs for Amumu. His clear speed is faster. His utility for his team with the W refresh and the R applying are way up. Amumu will be significantly stronger in the next patch. And again, because his clear speed is now going to be faster, and to a pretty significant margin, this is a pretty big deal. All right, Alistair has changes. Alistair's Triumphant Roar now heals all nearby allies instead of his closest allied champion. I don't know if this is still only champions, or if it actually hits minions as well. It didn't specify. I don't know which one it's going to be. I guess the wording says it's going to be all things, but I don't really know. Otherwise, Trample's getting a 4-second cooldown cut, and the damage, which is based off his character level on the empowered auto attack, is going up, which is obviously a pretty big buff as well. So Alistair's getting a lot stronger. Wow, that's pretty sweet. Let's see how much stronger he got. Well, this is a refresher on how much allied heal came out of the passive. If you didn't know, Alistair receives half this himself, but now, instead of healing an ally for 100 HP, he heals all his allies for 100 HP. This is a pretty big deal. This is a pretty big deal. So he's going to be giving some pretty significant health pools back to his teammates in a team fight. This is a pretty significant team fight buff because you're getting these 100-something and change health value increases. And as far as the E damage, I wanted to bring up... Actually, let me move this so my head doesn't cover it up. It's going to be smaller because of that. Sorry about that, guys. But basically, of course, you don't learn Trample until level 3 because you start Headbutt and Pulverize, of course. But you're seeing sort of the damage outputs coming through here. The cooldown difference is pretty massive. And so you're seeing the cooldown percentage difference and the total damage percentage difference because I'm counting not only the E hit on auto attack, which is these two columns, but also the AoE damage by ranking up E. He does more damage. He does more damage and he has this more often. It's a buff, obviously. Cool. We're going to be good to go. Let's move on. It's better. Okay, so Bard has gigantic changes. 15 damage every tier. Now every tier now has also one of its utility buffs. And you can now hold 9 meeps. The full list of Chime tiers is this. It's hard to read, so we're not going to do that. Instead, I have a chart which is beautiful and amazing, and I don't care that my head's going to be covering it up because it's not that big of a deal. Okay, so it's worth pointing out that this chart is very huge, and it's very big. This here, I want to point out this gold line right there. This is you only get 100 meeps if it is 100 chimes. If it is a 42-minute game where you pick up every single one. Not only is 42 minutes longer than normal, which means it's a significantly above average length game, but you're also not going to pick up every single chime. So this bottom half of the chart is totally not worth reading for the average game. Instead, what you care about is pretty much up to this 210 damage point, this like 65 chime. Chime. This is what you care about, which means you're pretty much always having more meeps. You're most of the time having more slow. You're most of the time having more, or even just having AoE damage on it. Is most of the time recharging faster, and the damage is practically identical. And the reason I wrote 210 out here and 420 down here is because you're seeing some red marks in terms of how much damage it deals, right? Minus 20, minus 25, minus 25. But minus 20, when the damage output is 210... It's like, oh, instead of doing 250, I'm doing 235. Oh, but I have 5 meeps instead of 3. I wonder if this is a buff. So basically, it's worth pointing out that Bard's going to run around with like 150 to 200 damage meeps with like 3 or 4. Well, sometimes he has like twice as many meeps out, right? Gigantic buffs. Obviously, Bard is very, very strong, is going to be much stronger via these changes. And I wanted to point out, by the way, that Bard does need the help. His win rate around 46% in the support role. Not very big. He can kind of use the help. Camille is a champion. Actually, let me make sure I can do this. Okay, cool. We're good. Camille is getting changes as well. Basically, her tactical sweep no longer heals against minions. And her Hextech Ultimatum's duration is going significantly down. I believe it was Vander tweeted out that support Camille is dead. To be fair, she was basically never played there anyway, but worth pointing out that it probably is dead because it's based on level of the ability, and support Camille not going to gain a lot of XP. But let's look at the numbers, the numerical difference. And I wanted to point out exactly how much healing actually came out of Tactical Sweep. And this was the max healing just base. This is assuming she maxed W last because the cap... Sorry, not the cap, but the damage raise is based on rank, but she maxed it last. The cap is based on her max HP, and this was basically 1/10 of her max HP. You could see that she was healing for a half-decent amount if she was hitting these. And then the cast minute health is not exactly accurate, but this is the minimum and the maximum health bar for a cast minion. The actual tiering in the middle might be slightly off, but it's close enough to know that you're getting 20-ish health per cast minion from Tactical Sweep. And of course, melee minions are roughly twice as durable, and cannon minions are roughly twice as durable as that. So if you have the melee wave, of course, you're getting twice as much HP, but this is how much health you are actually getting from Tactical Sweep. It's a decent amount, and again, the cap was a decent amount as well, considering she was going Trinity Force and often Titanic Hydra. She had more HP in the build, so this cap was actually higher, but this is just the base values against caster minions. This is actually what she's losing out via those nerfs. And you can see it's actually somewhat pretty reasonable, somewhat pretty decent, somewhat pretty meaningful. And the reason why, by the way, this is Camille's pick and ban rate in 7.5 in pro play. You can see that she was already losing lane. That didn't matter. She was winning 2/3 of her games. And she was in 94% of all games, 204 bans and 30 picks. Everyone seemed to care about Camille. Oh, this is by the way, in all lanes' way, by the way. So it's actually in all possible roles, Camille was still the #1 champion in League of Legends. She was real good. She won a lot. She got played the most of any champion ever. The champ needed some nerfs. Now, Galio has some kind of small changes. His Colossal Smash loses some base damage, which is his passive, the ground slam with his fists. He gains an AP ratio on Q, and he loses some of his Tornado Zone damage on the back half of Q. This is how much damage is actually coming out of that passive, considering that it deals his total attack damage, as well as a magic resist ratio, as well as the base damage. So the passive damage is actually doing this much damage before you invest any MR. This percentage always goes close to 100% as you get attack damage or magic resist. But you can kind of see the numbers, right? It's like an 8% damage nerf by mid-game. The passive does less damage, to the tune of 10 to 20 damage. It's not huge. But basically, this nerfs tank Galio slightly. I think Galio was roughly balanced. It's more a re-shifting of power. Basically, he lost a base damage here, he lost a base damage there, he's gaining AP here. This pushes him towards AP builds. It makes him slightly less good as a tank build. Okay, great. Next up is Graves. Graves is real strong. So Graves lost the MR buff on True Grit. It's now gone. He lost bonus magic resist on True Grit. So what I did is I pulled up a chart. So this is how much MR he would have with a 2-stack True Grit. Now keep in mind, a 2-stack True Grit is what you get for dashing towards an enemy champion. If you're dashing away, you're probably not going to be fighting them anyway, so I didn't really count that. But I said if you're going to be in a team fight and you dash toward them, you gain 2 stacks. And here's how much MR you have by maxing True Grit second, which Graves does, compared to his base stats. This is what he used to get from it. This is what he gets, his old MR with a 2-stack, his old MR when you got max stack, which is in a long team fight, and of course what he gets now. And so what I'm looking at is how durable he is to magic damage after the changes. So if you dashed forward once and just fought an Elise, you're losing about 7% of your effective HP, 10% of your effective HP, 13%, 16%, 19% of your effective HP, based on what rank your E is. Now, of course, if you buy a Hex Drinker, the value of the nerf goes down slightly. the effect goes down slightly. But you can see in a giant team fight, this is almost doubling your durability against magic damage. If you didn't buy any MR and you were in a long duration team fight, you were roughly doubly durable against magic damage. You had 50% damage reduction against magic damage. This is pretty significant. This is what's going down if you got the max stack out here, right? He is much easier to kill by mages. And to point out why he even needs the changes at all, well, here is the jungle pick rate in pro play at 7.5. And dearie me, he is number one. Now, it's interesting to note, his win rate is not very high. It's actually not really winning all the games in pro play. That's fair, I guess. You can make that argument. Considering I talked about Camille's win rate just a little bit ago. But he is the most picked jungler, the only one above 90%, right? Only Rengar comes close, and spoiler alert, Rengar has nerfs too. And okay, maybe Lee Sin becomes the king, who knows? But he was easily the most picked jungler in the game in pro play, and thus he gets nerfs. I think it's reasonable. I think it's fair to do that. Okay, so Jarvan is getting buffs to his W, if you don't know the numbers. So his base shield is increased to everything except rank 4 and 5. 4 is identical, 5 is higher, or 5 lower, I should say. And his shielding value, which is the bonus per enemy champion, is 2 to 4% max HP instead of 20 to 100 shield. Now, these are numbers. How do you know if they're better or not? Don't worry. I got you covered. Okay. So, we're going to do this. His old base shield to his new base shield, obviously you can see they're significantly better. And by the way, Jarvan is going to max W last. He already maxed W last. Now he's really, well, he doesn't say he always did, but he usually did. But now you're really, really, really going to max W last because the base rank up is less valuable and the percent health rank up on this thing is also less valuable. There are now very crappy level incentives on the Jarvan W. You're not going to max it first or second. You're never going to max it first, but you're probably going to max it last now. So what I looked at is basically if and when the W tier 2, the enemy hit change was going to be a negative or a positive. I'm going to zoom in to show you these numbers. Slightly in the early game it is worse without any bonus HP, but keep in mind, of course, there's some health here. And in the very, very late game, when you max it, right, the maxing of this ability was so much extra shielding, and it meant you needed some more few hundred bonus HP to make it better. Worth noting, the entire mid game, of course, is stronger. And so my key takeaway is 2 different sections right here. If you W with 1 enemy around, and if you W with 5 enemies around, is it stronger or is it weaker? Worth noting that despite the fact that it's technically weaker in the early game, with the tier 2 version of it, the base value is so much higher that it is always stronger in the early game with one opponent. And keep in mind, it also now scales with HP. The shield now scales with health. So if you're going to go full assassin top lane, it is still more shielding despite having a percent HP ratio. It is only weaker in any meaningful way in the very late game scenario with 5 opponents in the middle of you, without any bonus HP, and even if it was going to be weaker, as soon as you buy 400 health, which is a Titanic Hydra, and that's it, or a Randuin Zoman, and that's it, or a Visage, and that's it. If you buy 400 health, it is now better in pretty much all scenarios. It never requires any more than 400 HP for this to always be a buff in all cases. So, these are pretty large buffs to Jarvan's durability. You're seeing some 40% increases at max rank. Now, to be fair, 40% is 13 plus 15 equals 20-something HP more. I'm not saying that's massive, but there you go. Those are the buffs of the champion. So Jinx is getting some very small buffs to her Flame Chompers on rank up. Worth noting, you max Flame Chompers last. This only matters at level 14 and above. This seems really, 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 really small. But if you do get a super late game on Jinx, you get a lot of Chompers out. So, hey, that's kind of nice. This seems really tiny. I don't think it's going to bring people who were waiting for a Jinx buff to play Jinx back. But if you like Jinx, sometimes this helps you. Kassadin has some small bug fixes and buffs. Netherblade will still whiff if they go into Fog of War, as all melee attacks do and all targeted spells do. But at least it won't whiff if they run out of range while still in visions. That's kind of nice. Forced Pulse gets a straight cooldown buff. Obviously, that's really good. This doesn't affect his laning phase at all, but it does affect his team fighting quite a bit, so he's going to have this as repeatable damage up more often. which is a big DPS increase. And his Rift Walk AP ratio goes up, which is a quick chart on because I think it's interesting. This is basically the damage, the base damage on the ability, the ratio increase on the ability, it's 0.1 higher, and per 100 ability power, how much more damage is this ability doing than it was in 7.6, which is 10 to 8 to 7% more damage. Now, I believe the ability also has a mana ratio, which I didn't include here, and considering his core builds have like Rod of Ages and Lichbane on it, this isn't quite fair math, so I probably could have done a better job on this chart. But essentially, this is kind of the tune of the buff you're getting. And I looked at what his full build would be, which is a 25% damage increase. But again, I forgot the mana ratio. That's my bad. But you can see that this 0.1 AP ratio is actually a pretty significant buff. Seems to matter. Katarina getting a nerf to Shunpo's early cooldowns. Now it seems that Katarina is always max Shunpo second, so by level 13 this doesn't matter anymore. But it does affect her early game. Worth pointing out that she does still have a 50% ban rate in solo queue. So people still seem to think she's overpowered, and her win rate is still above 50%. So she is objectively very powerful, and objectively people hate playing against her. This to me says deserving of a nerf. So, this is the Katarina E changes. This whole bottom portion is 0 because it's the same skill at this point, so we can cover that part up without any issues. Old to new cooldown. Here's the cooldown difference right here in the middle. This is how effective the nerf is in terms of her cooldowns. And then what's also interesting, of course, is how much longer she has to wait between picking up a dagger and Shunpo being back up from cooldown. The old difference was right here, 2.2 seconds at the very early game, 0.3 seconds in the late game. This goes up to 3 seconds without being able to re-Shunpo. So if she Shunpos onto a dagger, there is now a 3-second window instead of a 2-second window to hit her. This is a pretty significant difference. You can see this right here, I think, is the major nerf, which is how much longer she is stuck without Shunpo being available. And it's between 1 and 0.1 seconds throughout the early to mid game. This is actually pretty reasonable. This is a pretty significant change to her mobility. It's a thing. Lux is getting buffed. I've seen these be very contentious, but basically if she kills an enemy champion with her ultimate, she gets some cooldown back. I did a chart on it. And this is the base cooldown with a reset, the cooldown with 40% CDR, and the 40% CDR cooldown with a reset. Yes, if you have 40% CDR and you're level 16, this reset is now down to 15 seconds. This is all anyone ever looks at. They're like, oh my god, a 15-second cooldown ultimate. This is insane. Most games don't go to level 16 Lux with max CDR. They don't. Most games are decided by then. Yes, if it gets super late game, she can carry harder and do the crazy laser things. But realistically, you're like, oh my god, 8 seconds off my ultimate? Wow! Even the 20 seconds here is not that huge. It's not going to be twice per team fight anyway. Honestly, what seemed to happen is that this buff looks really good. And in playtesting, it's nice to have, but whatever. That's my understanding. Now, this is still a buff. Lux is going to be stronger. There's going to be people who, like, super hate Lux and can be sad about this, but I feel like in actual real impact, it's not that insane. With the exception of if she's carrying, she gets to hard carry as long as her ult actually gets the one-shots. You'd be surprised how often her R doesn't actually get the kill. It just does a lot of damage. So we'll see. This matters to some degree, but I don't think it's actually that huge. Nunu has giant changes. His base stats in health and health regen are going down, but now Visionary gives a bonus rank to his next spell cast, which means he gets more damage and healing on consume. He gets more move speed and attack speed to himself and his target with Blood Boil. He gets more damage and move speed slow with Ice Blast. He has more damage with Absolute Zero. This sounds pretty cool. It is pretty cool. Good for Nunu. This is the rundown of how much the durability changes affect him. In the very early game, he loses 4% of his max HP. This is already very high, by the way, so he can spare it. And it goes down to basically nothing by the end of the game. The base health change basically changes nothing for the late game. And even in the early game, it meant very little. His health regen a bit closer, this is actually somewhat meaningful. Of course, you still have Consume for health regen, and you still have your Jungle Enchant or Jungle Item for health regen as well. So this isn't the end of the world, but he does lose out on some regen. It does matter to a certain degree. So hey, some stuff to him. Overall, I would believe this to be a buff, though, because getting stronger spells pretty frequently is kind of nice. And hey, an 1100 damage Consume seems kind of decent. Rengar's getting nerfs. Rengar's losing some base damage on his Q, not the empowered, and some AD ratio on his Q, also not the empowered. So what I looked at is I did some quick math. Rengar is simply a jungler. And what I looked at was I counted runes and masteries into the damage output of this ability, which means I closed out the AD ratio in the early game because you're not going to buy any attack damage by level 4. Just to make it look less stupid and make the numbers look a bit more fair to what the nerfs actually are, I've already calculated the ratio in the early game. If you buy a longsword at level 5, okay, now the ratio starts kicking in. Okay. So basically, your Q does 70% as much damage for the early clears. By level 4, you've cleared your entire first jungle, which is when you got the first rank up in the ability. You're seeing this does a lot less damage in the clear, and by endgame, it's a 10% damage cut and a 40% damage cut off the ratio. This is a pretty meaningful damage cut, to be fair. It doesn't cut the empowered damage, but the fact that the ratio is always down is going to always affect his snowballing with Bone Tooth Necklace. It matters to a certain degree. And why did this champion get nerfed? Well, this is the 7.5 jungle pick rate, and here's Rengar, right at number 2. The only other champion behind Graves at 80%. Now, I do think that the Rengar nerfs are bigger than the Graves nerfs, to be completely fair. But it's worth pointing out that Rengar is actually not all that amazing in solo queue, whereas Graves actually was. Which is awkward, because it means that Rengar is probably dead for solo queue. I honestly think you should never ban Rengar again unless he gets buffs after this, because these are significant nerfs. He was already sub 50% win rate in solo queue. This will probably... I don't know if it'll remove him from pro play, but it might. Rengar might be dead for MSI. These are pretty significant, I think. Maybe they're not, and pros find a way to play around it. Graves will be playable in solo queue, probably still playable in pro, but probably not quite as good. Rumble, very minor nerf for the recharge time on his E. He was a very, very popular top laner. He's overall slightly strong. I don't know. It's not... It matters, of course. He'll be weaker. I think he'll still be the same pick he was in top lane. I don't think the tier listing changes for this champion. And actually, with Camille being nerfed pretty heavily... Well, nerfed a little bit. The nerfs matter for Camille, but Camille was often a counterpick to Rumble. With Camille being nerfed, Rumble probably goes up in tier list overall. He was already like a top 4 top laner. Now, Shaco is getting nerfs. Now, it looks like there's a compensatory buff here to the AP ratio on the passive. Realistically, Shaco's just getting nerfed. His solo queue win rate is 55%, and it's been that way the entire patch. Shaco is freaking bonkers in solo queue. For some reason, no one's banning him, and I don't know why. I really don't know why. He's getting banned less than Katarina, and his win rate is freaking bonkers. But this champion is dumb. This champion is so dumb. This champion is so dumb. So what's happening is the AP ratio on Deceive is getting moved to Backstab. The total attack damage ratio on Backstab is basically getting flattened, and it matches out at like level 5. It's better early game, worse late game. Deceive is losing its base damage, and Deceive is losing cooldown and its early ranks. Now, right now, everyone maxes Deceive first. But with the ability losing any of its damage scaling, maybe people don't max Deceive first anymore and the cooldown stays high. These are all nerfs. The only exception being if you went Gunblade, you might get a second backstab off in a team fight. AP Shaco, I guess, if he can backstab you, AP Shaco needs backstab, basically. AP Shaco can't just deceive onto you. If you face tank the AP Shaco and you don't turn your back to him, you're a bit better against him, I guess. As far as the actual numbers are concerned, here's Shaco. So the backstab total damage, right? This is counting his total AD ratio. I believe it's also counting runes and masteries. Actually, it is counting runes and masteries. So the total damage, you can see it's 7 higher for most of the early game. And then eventually it just stops. And then it's just weaker past level 7. But technically this is more damage in the early game via backstab. It's got an AP ratio, which is cute as well. Which, by the way, is worth pointing out that if you're clearing the jungle, this is an early jungle clear buff. Backstab affects jungle monsters, and you very rarely, well, you do some, but you don't do a lot of deceiving into jungle monsters. So his early clearing actually got better. His early clearing got better, and his wave clear early game, I guess, got better. And his split pushing late game got worse by backstabbing monsters, or minions and stuff. And his late game jungle clear got worse by backstabbing monsters. And his late game team fighting got worse by backstabbing champions. But his early clear for his very first clear got a little bit better. That's cute, I guess. And it's got an AP ratio, meaning if you do bring ability power glyphs, which some do actually, then that also increases with his backstabs. Deceives total damage. Once again, including his total attack damage in the mix. How much damage Deceive did, how much damage it does now. You can see it's still a very significant nerf. Even if you roll in his total attack damage, because that was going to happen with that hit, you're still losing a lot of damage output of it, and of course you're losing that AP ratio. And so what I put in the very end is, if I do a backstab deceive hit on you, and I deceive into you and backstab you, in sum total, how different is my damage? And it's, in a very, very early game, like a 13% hit. It's not that crazy. But if you were going to start putting points in deceive, it gets a whole lot worse really quickly. These are all very large nerfs. And again, Shaco needs them. So, good riddance. I hate this champion. Syndra gets some minor changes to her ultimate. Bug fixes. Basically, the cooldowns no longer reset if the cast was interrupted. It used to spawn spheres but not do damage. Well, now it just doesn't do anything. If she dies mid-cast, the spheres will continue to go. I suppose that's fair. And if the target becomes untargetable, Dark Spheres will actually drop in place. So these two are actually buffs to Syndra. This is a nerf to Syndra. I think these are very, very small. These are unusual situations. This really doesn't do anything to Syndra. I think she's still the same champion. And then finally move into Talon. Not finally, there's more changes. Move into Talon, where the early damage on his Q is going down. Now, most Talons, at least in the mid lane, were maxing Q second. Some did max Q first in melee matchups, so this is not always fair. The reason I put base in quotes is I am counting runes and masteries in the damage output here. 15 AD in Marks and Quints, and natural talent in the offense tree means we can look at a more realistic damage shaping, but you can still see that it's an 80% damage hit up until level 8 when you finally put points into the ability. Now, if you're buying some longswords by now, which you're going to have by level 7, you're going to have like at least 4 of them. This is not 80% damage anymore. It's more like 90% damage, but with just runes and masteries, not counting the AD ratio, which by the way is like 1.1 or something really high, this is a damage hit, and it's a somewhat meaningful damage hit. If you max it first, if you're playing a melee matchup, this is not as impactful, but it does happen. Worth pointing out, Talon's ban rate above normal. His pick rate pretty low, but his win rate has been high, 51.5%. He saw some pro play as well. I don't think he saw enough pro play to warrant nerfs for pro play, but he was pretty bonkers for solo queue, and thus I think by being a high ban champion and a high win champion, both those say players seem to care, and they do seem to win. You could make an argument not to do it, but he is fairly strong, so I think the nerfs are fine. Buffs to Volibear. This is kind of cute. The max bounces on R goes up. That's nice. It's much more likely to hit targets that you care about. Obviously, that's kind of useful. Good for Volibear. He was pretty weak, so hey, Volibear gets more lightning, and that's kind of cool. Karma gets some new splashes. That's pretty sweet. Quick change to how the Raptors work. The small Raptors do 20% less damage and have 15% more health. 15 to 10% more health. Raptors have more HP. That's cute, I guess. Do less damage. Basically, this... it actually makes the early Raptor start a little bit slower. For what it's worth, 400 HP instead of 350. Most junglers in pro play are starting Raptors at level 1, and oftentimes not even getting a leash. This basically requires up to one more auto attack per Raptor to kill them. This slows down that clear. As you gain more levels, it's easier to kill them off, so the durability change means less over time, but it does matter more at level 1. And overall, they just do less damage, which, to be fair, makes it safer to clear them, but it means that champions like a Mumu or whatever who wanted to clear Raptors and whose safety was tied to clearing Raptors are taking less damage on the clear. I think this is ultimately a buff to bad junglers. Like, if you're a slow AoE jungler, you're taking less damage. It's, I don't know, it's something, right? It's a slight change. I couldn't tell you what exactly is going to change to the metagame. It's probably going to be nothing, but technically this exists to a certain point. Things that didn't have real health bars now won't lifesteal. Wards already did this, and Zyra plants already did this. Now more of these champions do this. This technically nerfs lifesteal runes in masteries in the laning phase. It helps Yorick against Fiora a bit, which is nice. It does feel really good to like be a Lowy and not feed mad health over. So this is a really good feel-good change for all these champions who didn't want to give away free health, and now they don't. So hey, these are all buffs to these champions, because you often fought like a Fiora or a Ruin King in these lanes. Magic damage shields have a different color. All around Summoner's Rift going into the rotating game modes. Some buffs to the League client update. There's a bunch of stuff in match history. Check this out if you care, but that's not really the point of this. You can see your highlights in post-game in your profile. As far as bug fixes goes, this is sound. This technically could have mattered a lot. If you DC'd while ulting as Gallia, you could lose the ability to attack. Cho'Gath buff, his ult now counts the AP ratio in, so it helps you actually know if you're going to one-shot your opponent. Shift clicking for pings is better. While dead, ping abilities no longer shows you the wrong thing. Apparently, you could do weird things with Elastic Slingshot. And supposedly, Zach could actually revive twice in a really magical way. Oh, that's cute. That makes sense. Whatever, it doesn't really matter. Small nerf to Lucian, I guess, via his ultimate. Sound, textures, particles. Oh yeah, so Whimsy now properly CCs certain channels. That's important. I guess it's a Lulu buff, but whatever. Yeah, I've seen this bug before. It's visual. That's interesting. I didn't know that Elise could actually remove death sentence. That's cute. Okay, nerfs to Vi and Nautilus would actually CC things despite spell shields. Textures. Okay. Tahm Kench can't take away buffs as easily. That's cool. Fixed Daisy weight tooltips. That's nice. Okay. More types of damage. Drop Quinn off of Valor. That's a nerf. These are all very small. These basically don't mean anything. Yeah, these are all tiny. We're just going to move on. Okay, and that's going to do it. Of course, new skins. These look pretty sweet. That's it for the patch. Thank you very much for tuning in. I actually have to run, so that's going to do it for this. If you have any comments and anything you want to provide, any feedback to give for the videos, as always, I'm happy to hear advice. Please leave comments below the video. Comments in Twitch chat. Tweet me at RiotPhreak. It's over there. That's the one. That's my Twitter. There's my YouTube. There's my stream. I don't release my Facebook. We're going to go away with that at a certain point. Anyway, let me know. Thanks for watching, and goodbye.